All right. I think if I just start talking, council members will appear. Yeah. So I'm going to go on that basis. Why don't we start with the executive regulation?
You will see a packet that is Executive Regulations 22-19. This would reduce fire code permits fees. It's a method 2 regulation. The council has a choice of approving or disapproving. It may not amend. This reduction in fees relates to garden apartment only. You have to have more than one building to do this. It does only apply to a relatively small set of fees that Department of Permitting is in control of.
Okay, hold on. My theory is not panning out here.
You thought if they heard me, they might come? You know, I've never been this attractive before.
Come on, guys. All right.
Okay.
We were just starting on the executive regulation.
Right, which reduces fees for fire permitting by about $600 and some odd thousand. This is a fine regulation, although just last year you dealt with this fee. Last year it was to completely incorporated how they changed their fees consistent with all other DPS fees. The fire marshal's office and fire prevention was incorporated to DPS. Their fees originally were completely different. So last year you changed it to a flat rate type of a fee. Last year it was estimated to increase the fees by about $2 million because the fire prevention fees were not.
When you said flat, we changed it to like a per unit flat fee?
Yes.
Yeah.
Per building in this case.
Per building in this case.
The fees before were not covering the fire prevention costs or the fire marshal's office costs. And now this amendment would reduce the fees by about $600,000. In your packet, you will find a recommendation to disapprove, principally because, aside from a circular definition to begin with, it also included the fact that you could get this discount if you're within the same subdivision. And that caused some concerns because we have subdivisions that are in thousands of units. So I think the intent of this was to do it within the same complex, if you will, under the similar management or the same lot, rather than subdivision. We received and I transmitted to the committee a amended regulation that takes care of the problems I raised in the memo of having a circular regulation as well as deleting the phrase subdivision from the amendment. If you don't have a copy of that, I have other copies for you. But as a amended regulation, I would recommend approval of the amended regulation.
Okay. So your concerns were addressed by the amendment.
Absolutely.
And now you recommend approval
of the amended regulation.
Okay. Mr. Duando.
Thank you. Good morning. We were just trying to figure out the lights. So
the lights.
We weren't disinterested in what you were saying. Okay, so amended regulation sent over this morning. You're further defining what these garden-style apartments are. You think that is fine?
Yes, I would
Okay.
recommend approval of the amended regulation.
Okay, and I read that as well. We do have the larger question. Is DPS here? I mean, we can.
Yes.
Okay, about just, I did have some questions about the amendment itself. If you could, when I ask a question, you just state your name. So we're going to lose, the county will lose some revenue, right? And I think you guys estimated $675,000 a year.
That is correct. That's correct. This is Hadi Mansouri, yes.
Thank you. And DPS is great because it pays for itself by fees, right? That's the model.
That's correct.
So can you just talk about how long you expect that to happen and how you're going to adjust for that? I did not see that covered in the packet, and what you're thinking of long-term of how you're going to make up for that revenue.
Sure, sir. Again, good morning. This is Hadi Mansouri, Acting Director for Department of Permitting Services. You are absolutely correct. There is some shortfall in this new regulation. But as you remember, in 2015, we did a very comprehensive fee study for department, and we did complete A through Z, and we corrected all the fee that it would be equivalent to the cost of the service that is provided. Fire compliance came to us about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we started working on it. And originally, their fee was supported by general fund. And when they came, we didn't want to do anything until we study it and we see what is happening and what is the total cost is. And still, at this point, is not, we have submitted the original fee executive regulations under the ER 18. And on that one there, the study showed about 2.4 million that they should bring as a revenue. And in that regulation, there was an consequence, the negligence that it was showed the fee for in one complex, a same fee to be applied for the multiple building in the same complex. And that was not the intention. We didn't want to do that. So based on that, we submitted this new regulation, and that shows that is correct as that, and it just referred it to 10%. So how are we going to recover?
Right.
Again, that is something that we have two sections under the fire division, and there is a for new construction and for existing. So at this point, we want to study, we want to get together and really to see where all the fee that is coming up, and if there is at the end of the year, if we really do see a shortfall, we would address it. But we don't think it's going to really affect that much.
So if I summarize, based on the comprehensive fee study that you're doing, you look at everything, you think this will be a wash, you won't have to necessarily adjust anything, but if you do, you'll have all the information to make that and come back to us with whatever
Absolutely. We want to make sure when we come back to you, we have a full study and we have all the pictures in front of us that we've presented to you is correct and answer the respond to the questions properly.
But you have enough money in the reserve now to cover for the next
That is correct, sir.
year
That
or
is
so.
correct. That is
How
correct.
much is in the reserve right now? Do you know?
Well, based on our regulation, we have to have about 20% in reserve every year, going from budget to budget.
Got it. Okay. All right. That was my main question. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Friedson?
Thank you for that. Thanks for being here this morning. A couple things. One is I'm a little concerned about changes and voting on amendments and new ideas that we just get within moments of the hearing, and so I'm not terribly comfortable with that. In general, I think we need to do a better job of making sure that everybody's on the same page and we're prepared for the meetings before we go in and have a time to discuss them with staff and with each of you if we have follow-up questions. I'm not sure that this process, it's not unique to this particular meeting, but this is a process that's one that, is ripe for good decision-making and good policy-making. So I just wanted to note that. Just wondering here.
I'm sorry, let me ask you a question. When you say changes the last minute, are you referring to the amendment that we sent this morning?
Yeah, we're being asked to now approve an amended version based on conversations that took place between council staff and executive staff. And my point is those conversations should take place before
Sure.
this comes onto an agenda and before we're being asked to review it. I don't think that it's a good process that things get put on the agenda, packets get done, and then conversations take place. I think we need to do a better job of making sure that that everybody's talking to each other, and that when we leave the building on Friday, when we have a Monday morning meeting, that we know what we're going to be talking about. And what we've seen with this, and we've seen it before, is that we left the building on Friday with a packet with information that we had, and by the time we showed up today, we were being asked to review and vote on something that was different based on conversations that had taken place. And my point is, if it's not ready for prime time, then let's hold off and
Right.
make sure that those conversations are taking place.
I'll take responsibility for this. After I only got the packet done on Wednesday, I immediately sent it to the department. It is unusual that I have a recommendation for denial. The department addressed every one of the concerns that was listed in the listed in my memo, and changed their regulation completely within the scope of what I recommended.
I appreciate you following on the story. My point is the more systemic issue, that conversation of your concerns being alleviated should have taken place beforehand, and it's not necessarily when your packet was done and when the conversation took place and how this went forward, but a systemic challenge with the way that decision-making happens, that conversation should have taken place, and I think would have been better off for everybody, including the public, that it be reflected in the packet beforehand. So, if council staff and executive staff could do a more concerted effort to have those conversations beforehand, I think it would be in everybody's benefit, because the public is looking at a packet that doesn't reflect what we're talking about, which I don't think is helpful, and we're being asked to review something that we really haven't had the benefit of being able to significantly look through and discuss with our staffs, and it's just not the way that the process is supposed to work. Not a criticism of this particular packet or this particular situation, but really a criticism of the broader process that this tends to happen, and I don't think that it should. And so I just wanted to note that, but I don't want to belabor that too much. I do have another process-related concern here, based on the questions that Councilmember Jawando had mentioned. It seems to me that this is part of a broader issue and a broader question, and my concern is why we're addressing this one piece and not the whole pie, because we're basically going on a leap of faith that the rest of the concerns will be addressed, and I have a concern that we're going to be right back here because the increases are going to be dramatic to other units and other buildings, and it just doesn't seem to be a comprehensive solution to a comprehensive issue. It seems to be a one-off quick fix to something that requires a much more comprehensive approach. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. I don't think this was a quick fix, sir. This is something that we have studied for almost a year and a half, as when the fire code compliance, they came to DPS, and we believe this would solve the problem, and it should be fine. But as I explained to Councilman Raymer, if this needs to be something that we need to look at it again, absolutely, we will come bring it to your attention. But it seems like that it should be fine. There shouldn't be any problem.
So who's going to pay the $675,000? Whose fees are going to go up? Or is that going to come out of the general fund, or are we just not going to collect those fees anymore? Were those superfluous fees that we didn't need?
Absolutely, it's not going to, somebody else going to pay for it. It is part, the same fee, executive regulation that we have is going to be in effect. Nobody else is going to be paying for it. It should be fine the way it is.
So so the fees were too high?
Go ahead.
Only one of those things can be true.
All right.
Good morning, Rick Merck. I'm the fire marshal, DPS. So these are very specialized garden-style apartment complexes, and the unintended consequence of ER 818 was to treat every single building on a complex as if it were a new complex. And so what this does is, because what we believe will happen, and we've shown it to happen in our inspections, when we go to a complex to do an inspection, it's very repetitive. Most of the buildings are very close together, and so we can increase our efficiency, and therefore our time is limited on the complex, and we can move on to the next. So there is an efficiency, and we believe that that's going to cut into the fees that were being lost.
This was an accident based on the way that the original regulation was created, that overcharge for these types of complexes, and you're fixing that so that we're not overcharging for these types of complexes. Is that what you're saying?
Basically.
I mean, just let's talk about this in reality. I mean, I feel
Good
like
morning.
we're sugarcoating what the
Good morning.
reality is here.
Good morning. My name is Imam Mustafa, Division Chief for Fire Prevention Code Compliance. I will give you the history before we get into this detail. The fire fee was under fire rescue, and the original fee regs were drafted in 2006, were revised in 2013 with no change. When the fire rescue under the one-stop shop concept got merged in DPS about 2 years ago, we revisited the fee structure. If you look at the older standards, there were a lot of provisions for different types of buildings with different types of uses, different fee structures, and where fee was collected based on invoices, not based on inspection right away. So we were having deficiencies in terms of not able to collect the fee even after performing the inspections. So for that purpose, we revisited this, the whole thing, and we have done the presentations before the adoption of Executive Regulation 8-18. It went through the full process of putting in the register, public hearing process, and got approved by the council. This regulation that is in front of you is only for 2 items, which we picked. One, the definition, which was not in the previous regulations, multi-family garden-style apartment, which is typically a cookie-cutter buildings in a complex. So we added that definition to simplify. Secondly is, in the fee regulation, the regulation says $95 for the first building and 10% for the rest of the building in the same complex. Since I use the word cookie cutter, it's the same garden style building, 3 stories or less, with 4 or less units per building, same type. So we classified this into a specific use category and a specific type of construction, so we've simplified it. With that in mind, we have drafted these 2 changes in this regulations, which are different, I will say, to the previous regulation that was approved under Executive Regulation 8-18. Financially, the benefit is this. Now, the fire department, this unit is with us. We can utilize our automation system. We have deleted the 10% automation fee that was part of the fee regulations. So we are looking for efficiency using our computer system, looking the different types of buildings that we can group it and make it easy for the customer and also for us. Thank
I
you.
appreciate the history. I'm all for fees going down, and I'm all for efficiency, and I appreciate all of that. I'm just trying to understand, it's a pretty tailored solution. It seemed to be that one type, your contention is that one type of building was being way overcharged. What are the other types of buildings? Or is this not an issue for a 4-story garden-style apartment
it is
or a
not.
5-story garden-style apartment?
It's not an issue for them because nowadays you're seeing complexes which has the first floor retail with restaurants, mercantile, and on top of that, podium buildings have 4 stories, 6 stories, garden apartment buildings. So their systems are one system in the building for fire alarm, one system for sprinklers, and this is different than a garden style building free, also independent of other buildings in the same complex. So we have looked at different scenarios, and under one management or multiple managements, those are the things we have discussed. We did the PowerPoint presentation when we proposed the previous regulation 8-18. We did a lot of homework for that one. We went through this process, and this one also, we went through the same process, registering, putting in the public register, then conducting the public hearing, and for only these two changes. And again, the definition we added here is for clarity. That was
And
the
what's the
intent.
cost for the larger buildings or other types of buildings? $95 plus $950, is that what it is for other buildings?
$95 for the fire code compliance permit,
Right.
and if you have systems of like fire alarm, it's a system permit, which is $95. If you have kitchen hood system in restaurants, it's $95. So based on what features you have in that building, what we need to inspect, that is what it is.
What
If
about the other buildings?
business
This is
building-
only for a 3-story building, garden apartment, and it's really only affecting,
the
as you've
change.
talked about, multiple of those buildings in the same
Complex.
property, which is causing the
Yes.
high fees that
Yeah.
you don't want.
Yeah.
How much does it cost for, there's plenty of complexes with larger than 3-story buildings, multiple in the same place. How much do they pay?
Good morning again.
Just don't have the full context here of what.
So
You're saying that they're getting gouged, that they're getting charged too much. You're trying to bring it to a more reasonable level. I'm supportive of that, but compared to what?
if I may give an example, and maybe
Sure.
that would be instructive. So if we look at a high-rise residential, it is basically, obviously, vertical, and we have dwelling units and one management typically. So all the systems in that building would be a part of one fire code compliance permit, which would be charged at $95. So we might have 14 floors of residential, and it's an FCC permit or fire code compliance permit of $95. When we spread it out into this very specific garden style, we may have 14 other outbuildings. Each one would be, under the non-amended regulation, would be looked at as an individual building and would be charged $95. So it would be 95 for all 14. So it jumps the process to being, rather than a complex for multifamily, you're charging much less in that case for multifamily as opposed to high rise. So that's the way it gets implemented.
How long did it take us to figure out that that was a problem? When was the original change?
Just last year.
Last year. We've been studying it for 18 months, though. Okay. All right. I appreciate it. I think it's interesting that in this particular case, the $675,000 that is going to be foregone revenue is no problem. We'll be able to work it out and figure it out. But when I brought up that we should not increase fees on rental units, it was like as if the sky would fall and all of county government would come crumbling down with it. I just find it to be a somewhat interesting dynamic. I agree with the premise behind this, that one large many-story building shouldn't be treated the same as one smaller 3-story building, and certainly a complex with a dozen 3-story garden-style apartments shouldn't be treated as separate, completely different ones that you can do in one stop. So I appreciate all of that. I just think it'd be helpful to have a bit more consistency when you look at these things, and when we're able to find efficiencies in one area, that we look at finding efficiencies in the other area, and that we be more deliberate with the way that we are charging the fees, since obviously the way that the original regulation was created was not reflective of reality. And we were way overcharging these particular complexes, albeit unintendedly. But, so the premise behind we can never change and adjust fees because we can't afford to, because that takes away funding that we desperately need in order to keep up with our needs, is not reflected, at least not in this particular case. And it would lead, I think, some to believe that, it's probably the case in other areas as well. And I hope that we can look at it comprehensively to really think through what we're charging, why we're charging it, how much does it actually cost to do the things that we're doing, so that we're not overcharging folks for things that we're telling them that they need to have, which are important for public safety, certainly, but that are, unintendedly or at least consequentially driving up the cost of housing and the cost of doing business in Montgomery County.
Thank you, Councilmember Friedson. Recognizing the efficiency that comes with these with this type of housing, where essentially you have a repeated format, it has been an ongoing issue. I remember a number of years ago, probably 5, 6 years ago, maybe more, I had to push very hard for a reduction in a fee that comes, I think, at the front end of the development process, because it was a similar situation where it was the low-rise construction type that replicates the same thing in multiple in a basically a flat structure rather than a vertical structure, and they were being charged as though they were almost like 6 different buildings rather than one building with 6 stories, and it was adding up to hundreds of thousands of dollars per project, and DPS ultimately did make a change there. In this case, it sounds as though when we set this fee a couple years ago, there was a misunderstanding of the efficiency involved in this issue, and it was resulting in overcharging. And so you're now proposing to reel that back and set a lower rate for this type of housing, which I think is good. I would join my colleague here in saying I think we all would want this to have been anticipated from the beginning and not have had to charge these units along the way. And taking over this function from fire and rescue has been an ongoing process, and there was tremendous amount of complaints about when it was run under the fire and rescue, and civilianizing it has been an important improvement in, I think, the experience of a lot of customers, whether in the development process or just as tenants in buildings and whatnot. It appears to me that the delta is a couple $100,000 in your annual revenue in terms of while this was previously collecting about $2 million. Jeff, just walk us through the fiscal note again.
Right. Last year, 818 would have raised an additional $2 million for fire code protection. This would reduce that amount by $675,000.
And what will be the impact of that on DPS's budget?
Again,
other than the loss of that revenue?
I think Councilmember Friedson was heading in the right direction from my perspective. I don't think there will be any reduction in staffing because of this. The cost will remain the same. At some point, you will see the increase of some fees to maintain their staffing and maintain the 20% reserves that they need. Every year, under the fee structure, the department is permitted to do an annual fee adjustment to the totality of fees. You may see that increase because of this change.
And is it the same fund as far as the inspection, the code inspection, and the license fees? Is it all part of the same fund balance?
It is all part of DPS's fee structure.
Well,
so it increases everything proportionally.
But are those funds separated? Is there any?
Not within their budget, if you will. They have one source for fees, and there are a whole number of permits. I can't even list the number of permits that they have, but it's all types, and there's one annual fee adjustment. They could, of course, adjust any individual section of fees by doing this type of amendment.
Okay, but prior to the fee increase, you had about a $1.6 million operating deficit.
That's
The fee
correct.
increase brought in about $2 million, so theoretically that's a $400,000 surplus. Now it's coming back down $675, so the annual, if you were to assume that this was sort of static, which it probably is not, but
Right.
the annual impact is a couple $100,000 to the negative in terms of
Right.
cost versus revenue.
That's correct. And I think your full budget is about 32 million. Do I have that number in my head right?
And we don't know what the fiscal, next year budget, we could hear that there's a sizable surplus in the fund and there's no need to, or we could hear that there's a deficit, like, we don't know.
Yeah, right. Certainly, their revenues are completely dependent upon the fees collected in that year. That's why the department maintains a 20% reserve to allow it to adjust to the actual fees that they collect.
Right, so we'll keep our eye on that, and I think in the meantime, we should do our best to charge what we think is fair whenever we have the opportunity, and in this case, we have the opportunity to adjust this fee so that it's more fair for a particular type of building that was being overcharged. And as for the legislative process that we've gone through, so Councilmember Zions recommended in his packet last week, not approving, and but it was I consider it a technical, detailed objection, not a fundamental objection, and DPS responded with a fix to that, which affected your recommendation.
Right.
If it was something fundamental, we were, that the policy was being reformulated, I would have said, well, something's off here. But if it's a technical matter, I think it's in everyone's interest to keep the process moving, and we're sort of relying upon,
Yeah, trust me, I would have recommended specific changes in my memo.
Well, look, what Councilmember Friesen was sort of saying was, Jeff, you ought to have told DPS about your concern, and they ought to have made that change before they sent it over. Okay, well, maybe, Jeff, you didn't have time. I don't know. But this is a process where whatever they send over, and then staff says what it says. And it's a functional process. So we could have chosen not to take this issue up today in order to evaluate this issue, but that didn't seem necessary. And, the legislative process is the executive branch sends over a regulation and then the council staff reviews it. And so, that's what happened in this case. Okay. Mr. Joando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the clarification. I look, we got a big county, got a lot of permitting. I think I want to say good job. It took a little longer than it maybe should have since we had the transition, and you're nodding to appreciate. But I think one of the reasons I ran, and many of us, so we could come in and do a review. Where can we reduce regulatory burdens? Where can we reduce fees? Where can we make things more equitable and I think what we're going to take action on today, hopefully recognizes that. Would like to see this more of these coming back to us in a more comprehensive fashion. But I think, look, when you're doing that's what we should be doing. We should be reevaluating constantly. Government changes, things change, mistakes are made. We should be in a constant state of oversight and reevaluation on the executive side and oversight on our side. So I think it's a good thing overall. I did want to ask about the condominium communities. They've often complained, I think rightfully so, about fees disproportionately impacting them. This does not impact those communities, correct? Depending on the building type, I guess.
Right. If this were a complex of buildings in the condominium, a single condominium regime, it would affect them. It would lower their fees. And I think the original complaint was from a condominium. It was. I see nodding. So this would lower condominium fees to the extent there was a common ownership within the complex.
That's correct, as your,
Yes, sir. From the building and fire code aspect, we don't use the term condo in the fact that that's more a real estate type. So we look at, and I understand that's the vernacular, we look at it whether it's owner occupied or not. And so in
this will apply to all owner occupied regardless of the type, as long as they fit the definition.
either one,
Yeah.
either one, owner occupied and not owner occupied, it would affect both.
Got it, okay. All right, so that's good. So there will be some benefit, but again, my point, I think we need to look at all these, the fee structure, particularly for the common ownership communities, but across the board. And you said the timeline again for coming back. What's the, where are you in the process of the fee structure review and recommendations and all that?
We have submitted our department fee already, so it's going to be, we're going to revisit this next year when we're submitting.
So there's, I understood you to say that there were some additional changes,
No, no,
revisions
no,
coming.
sir.
No,
No,
so
sir.
what you submitted is what we've got,
That
and
is it,
we'll
sir.
review
Yes,
it
sir.
next year.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Yes,
All
sir.
right. Well, I would just say, let's keep looking for ways to make it equitable and savings and keep talking about that. Thank you.
All right. So we have amended staff recommendation. Well, we have a staff recommendation of an amended regulation. And any objection? All right, we're in support of that. Let's move on to the next item. All right, so we're going to take up the air conditioning bill. We will not vote today. We'll work our way through issues and just surface anything that may require additional conversation if there is. We have a packet that Christine Wellens has prepared for us, and we'll ask her to walk through that. There have been, I know we've heard from GCAR about an issue that they would like to have discussed, so I think we can invite them up later. We may invite people up as we go, as we get into details, to just talk about the issues and what their impacts are. So we'll just proceed point by point through the packet. Christine?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. Before you, as you know, is Council Bill 2419, Landlord-Tenant Relations, Obligations of Landlord Air Conditioning. So this bill would amend Chapter 29 of the Code, Landlord-Tenant Relations, to require a landlord to supply and maintain air conditioning in rental housing. The temperature required would be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the requirement would apply for a time period between May 1st and September 30th. This bill, I should have mentioned, was introduced on July 16th with lead sponsor Councilmember Hucker and co-sponsors Councilmembers Jawando Albornoz, Council President Navarro, and Councilmember Reamer. On September 10th was the public hearing, at which there were several speakers in support of the bill, although some support with amendments. The Director of Housing and Community Affairs supported the bill on behalf of the executive and requested two amendments, one relating to clarifying how measurements of the temperature would be taken by DHCA, and their other recommendation was reducing the required temperature from 80 degrees to 78 degrees. On behalf of CASA of Maryland, Jose Murillo spoke in support of the bill. Okay, so CASA did not have any recommended
It's okay.
amendments.
We sort of know
I'm
where
sorry.
the public testimony was. That's all in
Sure.
the packet. I don't know that we necessarily need to reiterate the public testimony,
Sure.
you know.
Do you want to start
Where
on
it's-
issues then?
Yeah,
The
yeah, let's go
specific
through
issues?
them.
Okay, so the first issue noted in the packet is required temperature. As I mentioned, DHCA would support reducing the required temperature to 78 degrees. The Montgomery County Renters Alliance supported reducing the temperature to 75 degrees. So that's a decision point for the committee.
Okay, so I don't know if the bill sponsor wanted to just share some of his thinking about the different temperature issues. I'm sure there's some complexities to the topic, and we'll turn it to, if you'd like to make any general comments, and then we'll turn it to DHCA to ask for their view on their recommended amendment.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for taking this up. I really appreciate the support of DHCA and all the advocates that spoke up for this bill. I learned a lot even at the press conference we held for the bill. It was powerful to learn that tenants in the Charter House had passed away due to unheated apartments, and it was powerful to hear from the Deputy Health Commissioner about the medical conditions that are exacerbated by unheated apartments, including heart disease and respiratory conditions, and we heard that from a number of tenants. So I'm not a doctor. We wrote the bill at 80, obviously. I know there was interest in lowering it, both from DHC's original position, and I think the acting director even recommended a lower temperature. So I'm fine with either of those amendments.
All right. So, Director Nigam, would you like to comment to us on your recommendation?
Asim Nigam, Director DSCA. Chairman Reamer, as I mentioned in my testimony, we would support lowering the temperature to 78 degrees. And that's based on what our code inspectors have observed, what would be comfortable temperature. And also, if you look at the utilities companies, they recommend keeping the temperature around 78 in order to save energy. So based on what our experience has been going into those units, we would recommend 78 degrees.
Okay, but the point here is that the unit, that the room has to be made, but we're going to get into in a minute like what we mean by room. I think that's the challenging part, but it has to be able to cool. The kind of underlying legislative requirement is that the air conditioning machinery essentially has to be able to cool it to 78 degrees. It's not that it will always be, because of course a tenant is free to set their, well, depending on the building and so forth, you can set your AC to 79 degrees if you want to, right? I mean, that's what I do in a 2-zone house. My lower floor is less than my bedroom floor, but it has to be capable. That's the fundamental thrust of the bill. Is that right, Christine?
That's correct. It has to be capable of meeting the standard of either 80, 78, or 75, as you decide.
Right. So you're saying that 78 is a better standard to ensure kind of the minimum capability of the unit.
Correct. And we do understand, people have different preferences. Someone may require, may want to keep their temperatures at 80, 79. So assuming, they can individually control the temperature, but at least from our point of view, the capability should be there to keep the temperature 78 degrees.
All right. Comments on this point? Mr. Jwanda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the proposal. Thank you to my colleague, Councilmember Hucker, for the bill. I'm proud to co-sponsor it. On this issue, I think 78, I would agree with 78, and I also wanted to point out, and if you want to comment or anyone wants to comment, we have a unique issue here in the area in that we have very high humidity. And I think that needs to be stated. If you're 78 or 80 degrees in a dry heat, that has different feeling. It feels different, and it's also has different impacts on health than it does in a place that's, D.C. area that's built on a swamp and where we have high humidity. And so I think we need to take that into account. 80 degrees with 65, 70% humidity has a significant higher effect on asthma, other health conditions. And, again, I'm not a doctor, but I did do some reading. I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night and did some reading and spoke to our health folks. That is something I think we need to factor in. And so I would be okay going down to 75, but I wanted to, but I think at a minimum we need to go to 78 in that period. Again, we're talking about the hottest time of year, the May to September time window. So I didn't know if anyone had any thoughts on that. I appreciate the impact, the inspectors giving their feedback, because I think, again, 80 feels different depending on what type of heat you're in.
That's absolutely correct. And I'm going to have Chris and Dan speak to that point as well if they have any comments from my staff.
Okay. Well, I like agreement. That's fine. Okay. So all right. And so I'll go with the consensus of the body. I think 78 at a minimum, but I'd be willing to go to 75. The other, well, I guess we're moving on to the other issue. So you want me to pause
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
I'll pause
we're
there.
just going to go
Pause there on
point
that
by
issue.
point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. I'm not necessarily deeply concerned about 78, although I do think as we talk about these issues, one of the things that we're talking about is environmental issues, right? One of the reasons and the impetuses behind the bill is the fact that it is hotter now, and this is becoming a growing issue, and I appreciate Councilmember Hucker for bringing this forward. That is certainly true, but the other aspect of this is that our standards for the way that we consume energy are supposed to change, and we're supposed to think about them differently. And by most environmental standards, we're supposed to rethink the idea of what room temperature is. So room temperature has historically been 72 degrees, and we've realized that there is a major environmental impact related to keeping room temperature at 72 degrees. And so most environmental advocates now talk about 78 degrees being the room temperature standard, which I believe is one of the reasons why, and was noted in the director's recommendation for 78 degrees. But we're not talking about ideal scenarios. We are talking about the heavy hand of government making a requirement with which you get penalized with a stick if you do not comply. And so it seems to me that if 78 degrees is the environmentally suggested room temperature that we should be utilizing, then we shouldn't set if you go above this number, you are out of compliance with the law at exactly the number that we think is the appropriate place and the appropriate rate to place it. And so for that reason, 80 degrees, which is what the bill sponsor had originally put in, would be in that category, would be slightly above what environmental standards we now have created as the new norm. And when we talk about the environmental impact of buildings, and we talk about more requirements that we are going to place on building owners for what their carbon footprint is and what their energy output is, I am a little bit concerned with giving no leeway, saying we want you to reduce your energy output, but you have to go at the rate or below of what we think is standard. And if you go 1 degree above that, if we're 1 degree above that, then there are consequences to pay for it. I'm also concerned and not quite sure with the what is capable, what are the points during the day that we're talking about, which rooms. I know we'll get to that later, but I think that fundamentally matters. The 80 degrees in a bedroom is different than 80 degrees in a bathroom, is different than 80 degrees in a kitchen, is different than that. During the day when fewer people are in the household is different when everybody is in the household. I mean, there are differences when you're spending a short period of time during the day in a unit versus all night in the unit. I think that there are differences here, and I think it speaks to the fact that it's an important issue. It sounds like a simple issue. It's actually quite a complicated issue that we need to work through. So my personal opinion would be to keep the bill language as it is, although it doesn't seem like others are in agreement there.
Well, okay, actually, now I have a question, because I asked a question a moment ago, but I think I may have been wrong in my phrasing. So the bill would require the room temperature to be 78 degrees, or the property is out of compliance. It's not that the equipment has to be capable of it, it's that the room temperature has to be 78 degrees. Is that right, Christine?
Well, the system has to, the way that it's written, the system has to be capable of providing the temperature.
Okay, so I'm looking at Circle 4. Can you, let's go to the legislative language. So I thought it was what you said. that we're making sure that the capability is there. Now, that raises some weird questions, like, okay, so you can have an air conditioning system but not turn it on? That doesn't seem what we're trying to achieve. On the other hand, it also doesn't seem realistic that air must be 78 degrees or you're in compliance with, you're out of compliance with the code. That seems like a little bit, that just doesn't feel quite right either.
Right, I see your point. The way I would interpret the language is that it has to be, the system has to be in a safe and good working condition so that it provides an inside temperature of 80 degrees or less. So
That's pretty clear to me. When I look at that language, that says the air must be 78 degrees or less. Am I wrong? Yeah, capable is not in there, but somewhere that language did appear in,
right, I think,
and it connects to the room issue. Yeah, sure.
I think some of the confusion here, I pulled up the heating language, and I know that the bill sponsor, one of his rationales is if we're providing this for heating, and that's a safety issue in the cold months, then we ought to be doing it for air conditioning in the hot months, and I think there's certain validity to that, and I appreciate that. And so if you pull up the heating language does what you're saying. It doesn't say, it says must provide in working condition heating equipment capable of maintaining a temperature of at least 68 degrees Fahrenheit in each habitable room, bathroom, water closet compartment at a distance of 3 feet above floor level.
That's the existing code.
That's the heating code in existing. What this bill says is, if you look at line 54, part 9, which is circle 4 in the packet, the requirement is supply and maintain air conditioning service either through individual air conditioning units or a central air conditioning system in a safe and working condition so that it provides an inside temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or less between said dates. That is extremely prescriptive. It does not give any ability. You must have a system. It must provide. I'd yield to the enforcers here of what that, how you would enforce that, but those look like two different provisions based on the language that's used in the bill.
All right.
Quickly. And on that, it's a fair point. I think the idea would be to mirror the heating language in saying that, it's capable of doing it, but again, we don't want to, and potentially in regulation, or I don't want to have I would want to ask DP or DHCA, do we have cases on the heating side where that capable language has provided an issue? Because you obviously don't want someone saying, okay, it's capable, but we're not turning it on. We want to avoid that. So I agree, it's totally reasonable to say, like, not every room at every moment of every day has to be at 78, otherwise you're in compliance. You have your little detector and you're in there. No, that should be the goal, to get the whole building or the whole unit down. But so could you talk about the enforcement side and on the heating side and relate that to this?
Yes, Dan McHugh, manager of the code enforcement section. I think that the code should be mirrored, the heat and the air conditioning as far as capability. The way it's written in the proposed law would definitely restrict us, as far as the specific temperatures.
So you're saying the way it's written, it would be the temperature reading in the room.
In the room.
It's not the capability of the system.
Right, because what we're going to have is, like we've been talking about, there are going to be folks that want it warmer than whatever. They may want it cooler, so they're going to have some adjustments, but with this, it's going to be more of.
Could you speak to the enforcement side? That makes sense. That's the first part of my question,
Yeah.
But then on the enforcement side of it, how do you enforce the capable standard?
Right now, it would be, as far as the air conditioning, it'd have to be cooler in the room than, cold air coming into it. There's really no standard as far as
So it wouldn't have to
coldness.
be a specific temperature.
No, just be cool as of today. This here is going to restrict it to a potential,
You're saying the existing code has to
Existing
be cooler than the,
just cooler coming out of the unit itself. There's no measurement as far as where to take a reading, what the temperature would be, or anything like that.
So for heat, you don't test at all
We test, it has to be 68 degrees in the middle of a room.
in the middle of the
In the
room,
middle of a room, 3 foot off the ground.
3 feet off the ground.
Right.
Okay, so
And we
so
wanna
you're
keep
saying
that
you would do
standard.
that in this scenario as
Right.
well?
Yeah, we want to keep it standard.
Sorry, I'm not following this thread a little bit. You're saying that, did you say that there is a requirement in the code around air conditioning now, cool air now?
No. He was using.
Only
he
if
was
it,
projecting.
if they provide air conditioning, it has to operate.
Okay.
But
that's right.
operation
If
is
they
where it's
provide
correct.
it, it has to operate. And
Right.
then what your test is, it must be cooler than the
Cooler.
atmospheric
Right.
air or something. And then with heat,
Right.
it must be capable of, but your test for that, you actually go into the room and you test the air, and it must be at least 68 degrees.
In the middle of the room,
In the
3
middle
foot
of the room.
above. Right.
So you don't allow a property owner to say, yes, my system works, but I refuse to use it because I don't want to use it. I want to save money. That
Capable.
capability thing doesn't protect
Right.
that property owner from actually operating the system.
Right, it's capable.
It's capable. And then
Right.
the 68 degrees, is that in regulation, or where do
That is-
you,
That is in the code, yes. Under chapter 26,
it's in the existing
existing code.
like, code? It's not an interpretation of the code, it's actually in the
It's in the
code.
code.
So it says 68 degrees.
68 degrees Fahrenheit. and I'll
Right,
have it
that's right, you
ordered.
just read that.
Yes.
So that includes 68.
Right.
So having a number in the code is consistent with the heating side. But there is a, well, what's the difference then? If we were to say 78 must be maintained, it sounds like if we have the number 78, then you will,
We would have a number that we would be able to
you would have a
say-
number that you would work on.
Right.
So while you're saying you think the language should be parallel, as a practical matter, there's no distinction,
Correct.
because under either scenario, you go into a room and you test the air, and it must be either 68
68
for
or-
heating,
or
or you would say 78 for cooling.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, comments?
My question on that, no, that's helpful, is whether the verb matters. I mean, the bill as written says provides. Is it more accurate to say can provide or is capable of providing? To avoid a scenario where, and you could add language to this, nothing in the bill would suggest that if a tenant, to save on their electric bill or something else, maintains the temperature at 80, they wouldn't be out of compliance. We could add language to that, but
Yeah,
if we want
I
to
think that would be
specific.
a good clarification. One way to do it would be to provide on line 54, or starting with line 54, you could add the capable language, or you could cross-reference to chapter 26 that, the air conditioning would be provided consistent with chapter 26. The DHCA's recommended proposal, which appears at circle 17 of your packet, directly parallels the language that they have regarding the measurement of heat that Councilmember Friedson was pointing to. So I think that if you were to adopt that amendment to Chapter 26 to parallel the language regarding heat, in addition to making sure that the language is clarified on line 54 of the bill, or starting with line 54, to cross-reference to Chapter 26, or to add the capable language, then I think that would be tighter and clearer for everyone involved.
Okay. Tighter and clearer, but we're still sort of grappling with this. The reality is, we want to have language that is clear, but the intent is quite clear. It's wherever you go, you need to be able to take a temperature reading, and that temperature reading needs to be able, wherever you go according to the parameters of the legislation. And that temperature, I guess it would be the center of the room, presumably. And that temperature reading must be a certain degree. So talk to me about 78 degrees. Is that achievable? Is that something that you feel like yeah, how do you, that doesn't give you concern, huh? 78 degrees? I mean, I guess not, the department recommended it, but to have a reading at all times is, what, as a practical matter, you're out there in the units all the time. You're in the buildings. Do you feel like this is something that is close to what is out there today already, and this is okay, or is this going to have a big impact, and we're going to have a lot of property owners scrambling? What's the day-to-day measurement of what people are experiencing versus this proposal?
I think these numbers are reasonable.
Yeah.
And, when we go into units, this is, pretty much what we're seeing is below
what
this
you're
number. Even in my office, during the summer, it was up to 80 degrees, and it's kind of warm in there.
Yeah.
So we decided, let's try to go with the 78. That should be a more reasonable number than an 80.
80 is pretty
which-
uncomfortable, right? I mean, if your room is 80, that's not you're
Yeah.
sweating.
Even with fans, it's still kind of.
Yeah, you could have a fan directly blowing on you, but that's, still going to be pretty uncomfortable. Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I guess what concerns me is you just mentioned your office sometimes is 80 degrees, so is mine, where our system in here doesn't function so great. I don't know if David Dice wants to testify about concerns about maintaining this as a habitable workspace, but all kidding aside, the way that your proposal raises this, from a practical standpoint, if you do this the same as heat, and you talk about bathrooms, for instance, if you have a facility that doesn't have central air conditioning and you're using window units that we're now requiring by law that you have, there's no windows in a lot of bathrooms, particularly in older buildings. How do you get it to be 78 degrees without blasting the window unit to a point of just spending a ton of money on energy? And you'd have to have, I just from a practical standpoint, a previous unit that I have lived in, the bathroom didn't have windows. It was down a hallway in a multi-bedroom. It was a 2-bedroom. We converted to a 3-bedroom where I used to live. In order to get the window unit from the main room, not the bedroom, because the bedrooms would likely be shut, to reach down a hallway past a little central kitchen, which is kind of like a hallway type kitchen, into the bathroom, so that the middle of the bathroom was calculated at 68 degrees.
Is the bathroom covered? Can we just
Well,
accept
based
that?
on the language that DHCA has provided that we were just talking about on Circle 17, mirroring the language, you included each habitable room, bathroom, and water closet compartment at a distance of 3 feet. So anything that's above the ground. So anything that's not basically below grade. That doesn't that include a habitable room. I would assume would be a kitchen, which has an oven and a stove. It would include a bathroom that has a shower and presumably hot water most times of the day. And so I'm just concerned from a practical standpoint how you would enforce.
Where are
this.
we here? Is this covered under number 2, Christine, or where do the rooms? I don't quite tell where they fit in your.
Yes, I'm
Packet
sorry.
structure.
Under issue number 2, we're looking at the amendment the DHCA recommended to alter Chapter 26 in order to place language in Chapter 26 related to air conditioning that would be parallel to the language that's required for heating, to specify where measurements would be taken in the room, or at least relative to the floor where the measurements would be taken.
Why? Well, Councilmember
Sorry.
Friedson has before, but I want to ask the same question. Why do you include water closets in that too, by the way? Nobody lives in a water closet. There must be a reason, but why is that included? I also have concerns about the ability of a window unit to reach a bathroom. That seems
Or
difficult.
even a kitchen if there's no window in the kitchen.
And a kitchen. And kitchens are typically hot. If you're running the oven, it's going to be a lot hotter. And it may not be possible to put a window unit in the kitchen. And yet, you could have a situation where units are out of compliance, all the time. And that just doesn't seem desirable for us to set it up in that manner. So, again, DHC has recommended for rooms, you've recommended habitable room, bathroom. I don't see kitchen, though. Or is a kitchen a habitable room? It's not, right?
It looks like I live in a kitchen, but I'm not sure that meets the statutory definition of a habitable
Studio
room.
apartment would be, living in the kitchen, but, Dan, is a kitchen,
Used for sleeping, living, sleeping, cooking, and eating is a habitable room.
So it is.
Does not include a bathroom, water closet, laundry.
It's because it's for habitable space, which
Yeah.
is, which we've
Right.
talked about before.
I think what we did here was kept it the
You
same
mirrored
as
it.
the heat, mirrored it.
But from a practical
But-
standpoint, how could you enforce, I mean, if somebody's blasting a window unit as hard as they possibly can,
Right.
and you went to the middle of the bathroom, which you are, based on the language that you have provided to us, go to the middle of the bathroom and measured it on a 95-degree day, there is no possible way, if there's no window in that
Right.
room, that they would be able to meet your definition of ability to have the temperature be at 78 degrees.
I think this could probably be eliminated as far as the locations for the bathroom and the water closet. It's more important for the heat to maintain the pipes so they don't freeze.
That's
So I
why
think
the
that,
water closet
Those
language.
two
I
items
was
could be
wondering.
taken out of this and amended.
okay, so that, now I understand why water closet is in there, is because it's a heating issue fundamentally. Because okay, that's helpful. Again, I think the kitchen thing is problematic. The second you turn an oven on, the kitchen temperature rises, and there's just not much you can do about it. And I don't see how we can have every unit out of compliance whenever the kitchen is.
It could be capable of having it if the appliances are not on at the time. It's compatible, right?
I mean, my worry is, it's just like, it doesn't seem fair to
Right.
do something that you know is going to result in non-compliance as a practical daily matter. It seems like somehow we can figure it out so it's more tailored, it's more,
Right.
more refined. Will?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. The current language, which we're already discussing changing to mirror the capable language, you interpret, it sounds like you don't have a regulation, but the way you're enforcing that part of the code is you're using your reasonable judgment to go in to the center of a living room, for example, and take a measurement for the heat, right? It's not a regulation that you do that. You guys just do that. Is that correct?
No, it's in the law.
No. The number's in the law, but the
The
middle
3
of
feet.
So
3
that's
feet in
all
the
okay.
room,
So
that's all
I'm sorry.
established.
When you go and do the test, for example, you wouldn't go in the I'm trying to use the heating example of this, but when you go do the test, you're not going to go test for it if, for example, they just turned on. You're not going to go open the refrigerator door and test for heat in the next to the back of the refrigerator. Let me say this, because in the refrigerator, you're not going to go to the back of the refrigerator and test if it happens to be in the center of the
That'd be
kitchen.
a really big fridge.
Yeah, and test for heat right there, right? So my point is, I think there's enough flexibility in the law. If the oven was on, the unit could be capable of reaching that temperature, but obviously if the oven's on or the shower was just on, you're not going to go test at that point. Is that fair to say?
And most of these are going to be on a complaint basis.
Right.
So someone's going to have, direct knowledge of the unit itself, what it's doing, what it's not doing, to call us in to be able to
Well, I don't
specifically
know.
determine what's going
I don't
on.
interrupt, but a homeowner, a tenant might say, my kitchen should be able to be 78 degrees regardless of my oven being on, and they might complain on that basis, and they would have the law on their side at that
Well, I don't
point.
think so, because you have discretion here. It says the unit has to be capable. It doesn't say it has to at all times be that.
Well, that's the question. We're struggling over whether it's capable or whether it's a
Capable
reading.
of maintaining a
And
temperature.
It says in the language, well, if we were to change it,
Yeah.
maybe it would
I
be
think
as
we
you-
can change it
but
to
as drafted,
The kitchen capability is easier, by the way, than the bathroom. If you have a window unit, or depending on the location of the kitchen, by the way, I think this speaks to that this is being more complicated than we are letting on, and by making it too prescriptive, we are not keeping in spirit with the idea that the whole purpose of this is to have good faith effort to have a habitable living space. And that should be the goal here. And by getting too caught up in the overly prescriptive aspect of the law, we are running the risk of the kitchen, to your point, everything that you've said, Councilmember Jawando, is true with a kitchen that is close enough to a window in a building that would require a window unit. But it's almost never going to be the case in a bathroom.
Right, well, we're
That bathroom is never going to. Well, I'm just pointing to the language, and the language that has been proposed, which is what we were talking about,
Right.
says in each habitable space, bathroom or water closet, each, meaning that any bathroom, any
Right.
room,
No, I get
and
that.
so it's not you have the discretion to go to whatever room you think is reasonable, and we are setting up a very prescriptive, very specific law that tells our inspectors exactly where they're supposed to go and how they're supposed to do it, and
If I could reclaim the time here, I
and
think
creates
I
it.
still have
Let's
it here.
pause for a sec. We'll go back in order. I don't know whose time
Well,
is.
you know, I was on. You
I let
went
it.
to me.
I let it become a free for all, which I thought was fine until it wasn't. So we'll go back. But I just want to interject here also. I think that there are buildings that are designed with kitchen windows that are small, and I wonder, do we know that every kitchen can accommodate a window unit? If DHCA can say with confidence, yeah, that's not a problem, that's great. If we don't know, I'm a little worried.
One thing with the window air conditioners is you have to have two windows per room to have a window air conditioner, because you have to have egress out of one of the windows and then a window air
And
conditioner.
kitchens typically are in an
Right.
apartment building, not going to have two windows,
And
are they?
typically also too, each window air conditioner has to have a dedicated circuit to that specific window to be
So-
installed and so forth.
So-
Kitchen probably not going to have one.
So here was going to be my point. I mean, it's very rare to have an air conditioner in a kitchen, unless you have a single-family home or something. So that, I think, let's state that. I grew up in apartments. I never had an air conditioner in the kitchen. The point of the law here, each of the dwelling units or individual living units where the cooling is under the control of the tenant must provide working air conditioning capable of maintaining a temperature of no more than 78 degrees Fahrenheit in each habitable room. We already said we're going to strike water closet because that doesn't make sense in the cooling context. Let's also remember that having a habitable room and air condition that's healthy for everybody is also due to ventilation, right? It's not just an AC issue, right? If you have poor ventilation in a kitchen, right, or if you have other issues that might be code issues, you could have a much hotter kitchen or bathroom or something else. So I think we want to be careful we want to set a standard, and then allow the law should set a standard, just like it does with heat, that says in a habitable room it should be this temperature because this is what we've said. I don't think it's acceptable that if you have poor ventilation, for example, in a kitchen, that you could turn on your oven and walk in there on a hot day and have it be 95, 100 degrees and you pass out and hit your head, right? So I think we should, and if your apartment building doesn't have proper ventilation or proper air conditioning to reach your kitchen, that's a problem in another area. So I think we want to set the standard and allow DHCA to evaluate based on case by case or do regulations if necessary. But I don't think we want to say it's okay to be 100 degrees in a kitchen or in a bathroom for a senior citizen.
Okay, but we're not talking about 100 degrees. We're talking about 79 degrees. That's the issue.
Well, if there's no ventilation, though, it could, or AC, it could be whatever the temperature. I was using an extreme example, but my point is, I think we want to make sure that there is some requirement in these other habitable rooms, similar to the heat.
We'll have to get to that. I'm just realizing now that the amendment on Circle 17 replaces a couple of different requirements. It's not just, it's also the first, it's the required temperature and the method of, because Chris, Dan, when you said you think we ought to have it be parallel, that is what you submitted, is something that's parallel. That's number 2. So when I referred us to Circle 4, line 54 and so forth, that would be replaced by the DHC amendment, right, Christine?
I think it would make sense to have the DHCA amendment present in Chapter 26, where the heating requirement appears. And I think it would make sense to amend the bill, starting at line 54, to cross-reference to Chapter 26. that's done elsewhere. Like if you look at line 33, for example, it says supply water and hot water is reasonably required by the tenant and adequate heat as required by Chapter 26. So similarly, I would put the air conditioning requirement in Chapter 29, but cross-reference to Chapter 26 for the specifics that DHCA wants to see. And that would be what you do with the heat, because we have heat here in chapter, it just says you have to supply adequate heat.
Well, let's continue here. We're talking about the rooms that are subject to the requirement. We're having a lengthy discussion about kitchens, bathrooms. There's more rooms we need to get to. Did you want to speak to that point?
I'm just interested in hearing how this would be enforced. What I mean, I've raised the scenario of the window units with kitchens and bathrooms specifically. I think there probably could be other rooms that are applicable to that if they're far enough away from it, and particularly if we're talking about residences where families live, where we have 3 bedrooms. I mean, these are not small apartments, and they could be relatively far away from a window. How do you enforce that? Is there any other way than to say that at 3 feet above, at 3 feet off the floor, in the middle of the room, if it is 78.1 degrees, that they have violated the law?
Mr. Mustafa.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm the Division Chief for Fire Prevention and Code Compliance, and also Acting Division Chief for Commercial Building Construction. Couple of things I want to point it out. Habitable bathrooms, we're talking about bathrooms, water closet, coat closets. These are normally unoccupied spaces. So adding heating in a coat closet or water closet or a bathroom, it's required for bathrooms, and I know that, but the thing is, if you limit this to habitable rooms, that is more practicable. And when it comes to the measurements, there are 2 measurements you have to take into account. When you're measuring the temperature for AC is different. When you're measuring the temperature for heat is different, because heat rises. So you're looking for the heat at that level of 3 feet. When you're looking the AC, you're looking the comfort level that typically the mechanical engineers will look at it at a height of 6'8", 6'8" inches. That's the volume you're looking from the floor to 6'8" inches as the normal area where you're looking for AC or heat. So the measurement criteria should be different. You cannot apply the 3-foot rule for AC because the cold air will sit there, where the hotter air will be above it.
All right, so first of all, Circle 17, is that proposed by council staff or is that proposed by DHCA?
There are 2 parts. The bottom half where it says after line 1, insert the following, that is DHCA's recommendation. I would support something, if not that, something similar to that to just make these clarifications.
All right, so we have, we've just heard that, do you want to? I don't want to. Oh, okay. Use your light if you want, and we've just heard that 3 feet is not the right tool for the AC, so we need a different room there, different number there. Is a kitchen a habitable room? I want to let.
Let them answer.
Yeah, exactly. I'm asking the executive branch to, the administrators to answer.
Habitable room does not include any bathroom, water closet, compartment, laundry, pantry, foyer, communicating corridor, closet, rec room, private workshop, hobby room, storage space, or fallout or emergency shelter.
Okay, so bathrooms are not included as habitable rooms, which is why initially I suppose the word bathroom was added. And then meanwhile, kitchens are included because they were not excluded. Is that correct?
That would be my assumption, yes.
And is there a different definition of habitable room? Does it have to be capable of having a bed? Something like that, or no?
No, that was the entire
What's
verbiage
that?
there. That was the verbiage.
living room is habitable, so you don't need to have a bed, okay.
And also, a family room, you don't need to have a bed.
Right, I didn't
Right,
need
so-
to have it, but I was thinking,
Yeah, the one that needs a bed, if you're looking at it as a bedroom, and the egress window requirement is from the bedroom, not from the family room, not from the living room.
okay. So the bottom line is, when we use the phrase habitable room, we're including kitchen. We're not including bathroom. So if we want bathroom in there, it needs to be separately articulated. And we already are in agreement that water closet does not need to be included. Right, that was non-controversial. And so I'll pause here. Mr. Pucker.
Thank you. I agree with the direction on water closet, and certainly, and the 6 feet. That's a interesting and important point. I just, especially for my colleagues that haven't been in this space of previous years, I really appreciate DHCA's support on this. Historically, I just don't want anybody to be under the presumption there's like an inspector outside every apartment with a thermometer checking on the temperature as soon as it gets to 79 and then issuing a fine. Nobody should be under that illusion. The fact is, we have 300,000 tenants. Probably the majority won't even find out we have a law. The ones who do find out we have a law, some won't necessarily report when there is a high temperature for all kinds of various reasons. They might fear retaliation. They might not, know the requirements of the law. There could be many, many reasons. Some will report, and then there won't be an inspector the next day. And we're having a law so that in the cases where there's an active, courageous tenant stepping forward and reporting long-term violations, the department, whose support I really appreciate, has the tools to go there. But they have limited resources, and they're not going to be monitoring every room in every apartment. We shouldn't be sort of acting like that's going to happen. This is so they have a tool where there's long-term violations. We have in the Charter House, right in my district, testimony in this room from tenants whose neighbors not only died in their unheated apartments, they were decomposing for days before they were discovered, and who in 2019 are passing out and going to the hospital for days at a time. So, I think I have confidence in the department they'll implement the law well, and they'll use their judgment when we put a standard in place.
Does Charter House not have central air? What is the
They have ineffective central air.
ineffective central
And they
air?
have added window units in a lot of the apartments that have failed individually.
Wow.
And that's just one. There's other apartments in my district that don't have any air at all or have, routinely failing air.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah, I mean, I trust their judgment, but I also don't want to set a standard in place that I know will be routinely violated. I think we have to have a standard that we think in a good faith effort is attainable with a property owner who is putting in a good faith effort. And so we just got to find that point. Habitable room. So does that include hallways, did you say? No. Corridors are not, your mic is not on, Dan.
Communicating quarters are no.
Okay. Andrew.
Thank you. And I totally appreciate the bill sponsor's points, and I largely share them. I think the challenge here is that good intentions don't make necessarily good policy, and that it's not that I think that there are inspectors that are waiting outside the doors to catch people. It's the fact that what expectations are we setting for tenants of what is reasonably going to be executed, and what positions are we putting our inspectors in? I mean, while I think that their discretion and judgment is important, I think that there is a limit to that. Our job is to, write the law and make the law be able to be properly executed and both set the understanding for the landlord and the expectation for the tenant of what the law is. And if we're not doing a good enough job of letting both sides know that, then that is on us. And I think we all share the belief that we could do better in that department on both sides of that transaction. I do have a question. The corridors, you've clarified, the closets and other issues, those are not habitable spaces. Foyer is mentioned, but in a lot of apartments, at least just thinking of the places that I have lived in, there is not much of a distinction between the foyer. Certainly I couldn't distinguish it between the foyer and the living area. I've never been in an apartment that had its own family room, separate from a living room. You were in the, there's the bedrooms, there's the kitchen, there's the corridor, that connects them. And then there's a living area. And the living area, the difference between the living area and the, quote unquote foyer is the small table that you put next to the door. I mean, that's what I'm used to in terms of an apartment. So just from a practical standpoint, how do we distinguish between rooms oftentimes that aren't delineated with doors, which in a lot of apartments that's the case. Besides the bedrooms and the bathrooms, even the kitchen in many apartments is not differentiated with the door. It's obviously easier to figure out what a kitchen is because that's where the stove is and the sink is. Can you just explain, what would be included and not be included if we're talking about what we're going to require? What's a foyer? How do you define the foyer? How do we define the living room differently than the foyer? Because that was expressly separated out.
The foyer would be right when you walk in the door. You don't really habitate in the foyer, you in and out. The living room, family rooms, dining rooms, bedrooms, those are areas that you congregate, are habitable space.
So there's just judgment to separate the foyer from the living room or family room or whatever, the dining. I mean, apartments that I've been in, that I've lived in, the dining room was an area next to the kitchen that was completely connected to the living room, which just happened to be the place where you could easily put a couch and have a television set, which was then directly connected to the entryway that you walked in on. There was no specific
The open
delineation.
concept, the open floor
Yeah,
plan.
yeah, and I think many apartments have houses or single family homes are kind of moving in the open concept, but because of efficiency of space, a wall takes up space, and when you're limited in an apartment with space, you tend to eliminate the walls if you don't need them. A bedroom, you need it. A bathroom, you need it. A kitchen, you at least need a couple. But other than that, there aren't a lot of walls. And so I'm just trying to figure out, where are we checking so that we understand as we write a law of how it's going to be enforced.
We'll check the habitable space, the living room or dining room or the bedrooms, wherever one is complaining that it's too hot. Chances are you're not going to complain about walking through the front door and it being 80, 90 degrees when the rest of your unit is at a reasonable temperature. So, you might pass through that. Not every unit is the same, like you were saying, but, habitable room, we're pretty much going to be using the living room, dining room, bedrooms as taking measurements.
Okay, so again, this is where I've been focused on this kitchen issue, and I might be overly focused on it from my own personal experience, but I kind of, in my house, I stopped using my kitchen in the summer because it made my kitchen so hot, and I didn't have proper air conditioning in the kitchen, and it sort of heated up the rest of my house. And so I just sort of switched my habits of what we cooked, and I didn't use the oven in the summer. That's because I said oven earlier, right? I think I said oven. I have, as a homeowner, I am aware that there was nothing really that I could do in that situation other than stop using the oven. There was no solution that was going to work with cooling that was going to make my kitchen cool or prevent the rest of the house from getting heated by the oven. I wonder if I was a tenant, would I have that same perspective, or would I say no? My dining room needs to be cooled, and it should be able to be cooled regardless of whether my oven is on. I could see someone having that as a reasonable perspective, right? You just look at things a little differently. But it wasn't practical. There was no practical way to do that. Again, that's why I'm just sort of, I'm concerned that we get it right. And the kitchen thing is what is getting to me. I think a person's living room ought to be cool, like that makes sense. But I think we ought to draw out the kitchen. And I don't think that would really change this. I don't think, we're not making motions today, we're just talking. I think we ought to research this. And maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe this is not an issue. But I don't like setting a standard that we say, don't worry, DHCA will not use this standard. We will rely upon them on their discretion not to enforce the law. If we think that generally it won't be used, we shouldn't put it in law. We can give them wiggle room, but we shouldn't establish a standard that we expect that they won't use. We should establish a standard that we expect that they will use. But this is just one slice of a very broad issue. Yeah.
I totally agree that DHCA, loan council staff, would be great to have some research done on the kitchen/bathroom. I'd add the bathroom in on that. I know we have a current definition of habitable space, which you've laid out several times, which I think from a law perspective, policy, it would be good to keep the same definition of habitable space, and then allow, but as you mentioned, sir, the difference between where you measure, the issues that come up to me, fundamentally, we're trying to do the same thing for heat. We're trying to set a standard of what the highest maximum temperature should be for the health and safety and well-being of our tenants. We've agreed to remove water closet because there's a difference between why piping needs to stay warm as opposed to staying cool. You've talked about the issue of where to measure from. It's different. Heat rises, so it's different from measuring cool. That's a very valid point. Again, I think it could be left to regulation and interpretation of the law, but that's a good point. And then the issue of the kitchen/bathroom, realizing that those entities, depending on a hot shower or a hot oven, can change the compatibility, the temperature in the room. That being said, we're not the first to confront this anywhere. So I think before we come back and have to vote, it would be helpful for me, from DHCA and from council staff, to have a little more research of what are the best practices around those two areas in particular. I will say that I am concerned. I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation in an apartment you want to have proper ventilation. You want to have a reasonable temperature in your kitchen so that you can cook and eat, which is also part of living in a habitable place. So I think there's got to be more out there than we have up here with our expertise. So I would agree with the chairman that we should look into that and revisit those issues. And I'm open to revisiting them, but I just want to do so with more information.
All right, I think we ought to get to the issue of, well, let's just talk about, there's a number of other issues. Before I turn to you, Councilman Friedson, there are a number of other issues we still have yet to grapple with. There's this whole issue of the two-pipe systems, which I'm mostly familiar with from our school system last year, which, made a calculation about when to turn on the air conditioning or the heat or whatever. It didn't quite work out right, and everybody was really hot. So I know that there's some issues there. So we need to talk about that. The time of year, which may be related to the two-pipe thing, I think we need to learn about that. And we need to have a conversation about how this applies in rental houses that are single-unit house properties. GCAR has raised some questions about that, and so I'd like to talk that through. And I'm sure there's some other issues we need to get to as well. Andrew, yeah.
I think those are important issues that I'm interested in as well. I just want to add one more kind of question that I think we need to grapple with is there's nothing preventing a landlord from charging you for this, right? Like if I have a system that allows for air conditioning to be a certain temperature, you still have to pay for the utility. Is that correct? Or does this require, I think certainly if we move to the heating language, that would change it. I think with the bill as drafted, I was a little concerned with required to have and maintain, or whatever the language was that included maintaining, that put the impetus on the landlord, which obviously then through pass-through you could pay through rent, but ultimately, begs the question of, utilities. But if that's the case, then I just want to raise the question of what happens in a building that currently doesn't have air conditioning with existing tenants if, in order to implement this, the rent is raised, or they charge a $25, $50, whatever the case may be, charge that they say is what it is. And MHP raised this issue as well of some units, Montgomery Housing Partnerships, which provides affordable housing, where they provide the opportunity to have a window unit in a non-air conditioned building, and many of their tenants decline because they don't want to pay the additional charge. One, I want to make sure that that is still allowed based on whatever language we draft. And number two, what then happens? What is the requirement that the landlord has to demonstrate that the opportunity was there to have a system like a window unit installed at a charge to the tenant, and the tenant decline? Is that something in writing? Is that something in the lease? How do we administer and enforce that aspect? So I just wanted to add that one since MHP raised that issue.
And Councilmember Friedson.
Where did MHP raise
Oh,
that?
sorry.
It's not in the packet.
No, it's not. It came in on Friday afternoon. There was a letter from MHP that raised a couple of issues.
All right.
But I just wanted to point out that in the way the bill currently is written, beginning with line 58, is intended to clarify that the tenant's obligation, to pay for electricity or gas would not be affected. So that doesn't completely answer your question about, could rent be raised due to the fact of you're implementing a new system, right? But that's just on the gas and electricity issue and not.
But
be
property owner
impacted.
doesn't have to justify why they raised the rent, so, is that what you're asking?
I'm just pointing out, in terms of how we actually implement this, MHP raised the issue of in any building that they have, that they offer, many of their buildings that they buy in order to preserve affordable housing, specifically for low-income tenants, many of those buildings don't have air conditioning because they're older buildings. It's one of the mechanisms that they're able to retain them as affordable housing. They have said that many of their tenants, due to the demographic largely that they're serving, have declined, largely probably for financial reasons. Maybe they can't afford to accept it. And so the question is, would that still be permissible? Could a tenant decline
I think the answer
the
to that
window
is
unit?
no,
And then
but unless we were to change it to allow it.
I'm just raising the issue and whether or not, A, we should allow that, and B, how we would implement it. It was raised. I think it should be addressed. I just wanted to add that to the issues that we
list of
discussed.
Issues, yeah. So we'll come back to that. I'm going to go to Councilmember Hucker.
I'm sorry,
here in
can I
second,
ask a
but-
question about the MHP letter? So in addition to that issue, the other issue they raised was sort of the issue of a transition period of when would these requirements go into effect? Is that also something that
Yeah, I think
we need
we'd
to
like
address for the
yeah.
next round of?
Yeah.
Okay.
And could we have some information for the next discussion about the number of units that are not conditioned today? Is there any, do you have the ability to get that?
I don't think we have that information anywhere available. We don't track which ones are air conditioning and which ones are not. You can almost assume that a lot of the larger high-rises and so forth do have central air, but, the smaller units may not.
You don't have that through like building permit, inspection data? Well, at least we could ask maybe MHP what share of theirs. They could probably, maybe they can tell us.
Well, we can also look to see if the census maybe tracks that.
Sure.
The census may ask that question, and we can look to see if
It'd
there's
be helpful
anything
just to
available.
know like what impact we're going to have. Are we just useful information? Tom?
Thank you. I do think you're right. It would be helpful to know that information. My sense, just as a recipient of constituent calls for years, is that the vast majority of buildings have some air conditioning, and the problem comes when landlords just don't maintain it. And this could be individual townhomes, or it could be and that seems to be consistent with DHCA's impression, right? Most buildings have air conditioning, and there's more problems where there's a lack of maintenance than where there's just no air conditioning in the first place.
Correct. I think that the intent of the bill is very noble. I mean, what we are asking the landlords to have is the capability of providing AC in their units. That being said, all these questions that are being raised, they are valid questions. One of the comments that MHP had raised was about a redevelopment scenario, which they are looking at for one of the properties. And that's, I think, we can address as a waiver process within our regulations in terms of giving them some, an owner like that, some leeway for a specific,
Can you explain that a little bit? You're saying MHP has asked that if they were to buy a building, that they could be exempted?
Well, no, they have actually bought a building and they want to redevelop it. So their question or their comment that came here on Friday was, should they be allowed to have some leeway in terms of compliance from this law? Because if they were to comply with the law, then they have to go back. It will add to the cost of not all units may be conducive to having an AC. B, even if they have the AC, there may be other issues, whether financial or otherwise, which may impact the ability of doing the redevelopment going forward. So on that point, we think that we can address that issue by giving them some sort of a waiver in similar situation for a specified period of
I was
time.
just going to ask, is there like a waiver provision that the HCA, if you agree that just for circumstances such as they are, that you need it?
I think it's reasonable. If I could reclaim my time.
Go for it.
They say in their letter very clearly, the majority of their properties have air conditioning, and they have a small number of older properties that do not. It'd be helpful to find out how many that is, but it's clear they're for the bill, and they have these one practical consideration and then a couple hypothetical questions they raise on the second page. In Forest Glen, where they have an older facility with window units and it's scheduled for renovation, they would like some forgiveness until the renovation starts. And I think that's one more thing you could just add to the list. If a property is scheduled for renovation, what are the requirements? What are the expectations of the current landlord? The other thing that they raised about whether this will open the door for landlords gouging their tenant with unreasonable fees. Landlords can gouge their tenants with unreasonable fees today. For all kinds, reasons or not reasons. And the $50 a month that they suggest as a non-trivial amount, that's true. It's for a few months a year, and it's maybe 1 week's rent compared to the average rent being $1,500 or more for a one-bedroom in Montgomery County, right? So anyway, they have a couple hypothetical things here. I think it's we're talking about a very small number of units that they're raising, both in MHTP properties, by their own admission, and certainly in my experience and DHCA's testimony.
Yeah.
I don't think we should get too hung up on it, because it's
Right.
a small number.
Well, I guess I just, I would like to explore this concept of a waiver. Do you need the law to state that a waiver is allowed in order to provide a waiver, or do you have the ability to grant a waiver? The reason I'm asking is, what if there's a building that you feel is well maintained and the units are satisfied, they don't have air conditioning, but you don't feel like you would want to impose that requirement there for some reason? Would you be allowed to exempt that?
I believe that if you wanted to provide for that, there should be an amendment that requires DHCA to adopt regulations on this, including addressing the issue of waivers. Alternatively, there could be an uncodified section providing for sort of a transition period or providing for certain types of properties that would be exempt
Authority to do
for-
waivers would
yeah.
probably be satisfactory, would be my guess.
Well, I forgot, we're only talking about the ones where the tenant doesn't have any control because it's a master metered apartment. So the vast majority have something, and then, where there's the requirement and the tenant can control the temperature, the tenant's in control of any additional costs that they're incurring. And if they choose to reduce their energy usage and be in a hotter apartment, well, that's up to the tenant. That's fine. It's only really in the subset of the subset, the ones who are going to be covered under this bill and have master metered apartments, where there would be potentially an increased cost to the tenant.
Right. All right. We have not talked about common areas yet. Are you finished, Tom? That's right. Did you want to speak to, you want to start on common areas?
Yeah, if we can.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't want to, if we're not done with this part, keep going.
If we're not done with this part, I'm not even totally sure what this part is anymore.
Talk about
I think we're talking about the rooms. We flagged a number of issues that still have to be addressed. I actually think we're going to have to call it here in about 10 minutes. So I don't know that we've had a chance yet to get to the G-Car stuff, and we won't, I don't think, today. Why don't we work on common areas?
Yeah, quickly on that was kind of raised by staff as an issue to talk about with the rooms, which we've talked about the rooms quite a bit. I do think it's very reasonable. I think Renters Alliance raised this, but I think it's reasonable to have common areas included. You don't want to have a situation where people can't congregate and be social and live in and use the amenities of the facility that they're in. I think, again, this is only going to apply to units, the multifamily that have common areas. So, but I'm curious I don't know if we have a DHCA opinion on it, but to me that seems reasonable. And do you currently, I guess to be more pointed, I'm assuming, but do you currently enforce heating requirements in common areas of multifamily housing?
Yes, heating requirements in common areas is enforced, yes.
So then would it be your intention and understanding that this bill should also cover common areas for AC?
Yes, this could be included in that as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence on this. I agree with everything Councilmember Jawanda said, but I agree. We really didn't look into common areas when I think the bill was drafted, and that's an oversight on my part, and I think they should be included. I think they should be included because it's nice for people to congregate, but it's also important, I think, for there to be a sort of backup area for every tenant to have access to, because I anticipate as we move forward, we'll probably add some language about allowing a landlord some reasonable time to make repairs, to order a part for the air conditioner or whatever, and then the law won't be enforced for whatever period that you all decide. The question then begins, where's the tenant supposed to hang out? Are they hanging out in their really hot, overheated apartment and potentially exacerbating their respiratory condition, or do they have somewhere to go? And if they can't go to the common area as a place of refuge, they really don't have somewhere. And just as an anecdote, when we introduced the bill, and I had a media request, and they said, where can I find some tenants that might be affected by this? I didn't have anybody teed up, but I said, well, your best chance might be to go to Charterhouse. So they go over to Charterhouse, and Ella Cassidy, who testified that at the bill hearing or at the press conference, she that day had with her husband left their apartment because it was so hot and gone to the common area. And when she got to the common area, that was also so hot that she passed out and went to the hospital. So that's, obviously why I think it's very practical to cover the common area, not just so people can play bingo, but because they have a refuge to go to when their apartment is scheduled for repair.
All right. Can you define common areas for us? What are we referring to? There must be some code definition. Is a laundry room a common area? Is a lobby a common area? Or is it a specific room that, has been designated as such?
It's basically goes into habitable space. So this would be like a foyer, communicating corridor, or a closet. It's
What
habitable
about, like,
space,
in
not
a building,
habitable room.
in an
Yeah.
apartment building? Is the hallway a common area? Is the lobby a common area?
Be the lobby, the corridors,
Corridors.
the hallways, between the units, the floors. Those are common.
You're saying
common
anything
areas.
that is in common is a common area. It's not like a designated.
Right. They the
Use.
the lobbies when you come in, everybody can gather it. It's a common area. When you walk up the stairs or you go up the elevator, that's a common.
So this is a
corridor,
little
common
challenging because
hallway.
the hallways may not have the ability to have separate,
Some may, some may
units.
not. Correct.
and then you're putting a 7 to 8 degree requirement in a space that there's no way to cool.
That could potentially happen. Yes.
So we might need a narrower definition. That's all. I mean, I think a room that is intended clearly as like the rec room of the building, that would seem like we'd want it to have cool air, and as could be a point of refuge or just a point of gathering. But we also don't want it to apply where we can't. It's not reasonable always. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with both points that are made. It seems inconsistent to say that in an apartment, a corridor is not habitable space, but outside the apartment, the common corridor is, required pursuant upon this. It just doesn't seem to reflect the goal and the intention. My view would be common habitable space at a minimum, which would satisfy the difference between a corridor. I mean, I'm even thinking of in some buildings, there's a breezeway, which isn't even really indoors. And so the ability to air condition a breezeway on a 95-degree day would be impossible. It also wouldn't be a place where people would congregate or would be seeking refuge, but the rec room or the lobby, I do concede that point. If we are going to move in this direction, then that, seems more reasonable. But a corridor and other areas. So I don't know if, I welcome your feedback from the, from the regulatory standpoint of a habitable common area, if that would satisfy what is being suggested here.
Yeah, we could definitely break out the common areas within these types of complexes to reflect your concerns.
You can do that. You mean you can work on some language to come back to us that will allow us to distinguish.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we should call it there for the day. This was a good work session, got through a lot of issues, got a few more ahead of us. Appreciate Councilmember Hucker's introducing this bill. I think it's an important step forward, and we need to get this done. All right, to be continued.